Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Sorry for the time that I haven't been online, but I've had a terrible cold and it's given me a bad cough and I lost my voice for a while, so there was a period there where filming just wasn't really an option. But I'm well enough now that we can get back into our videos and let's get into our 6th level spells for wizards. A couple little things I wanted to mention before we get into it though. The first is comments. So comments on the videos, I've always done my best to look at all of them, respond to anybody who asks for a response. I am getting to the point where there's more comments now, and that's harder and harder to do. I'm still at the point where I am at least glancing at every comment, but there's a lot of comments that I would like to respond to that I don't get a chance to, especially when they're comments that have already occurred somewhere else. So I might get the same comment 6 times on a video, and I might respond to one of them, and then I might not respond to the other 5. So if you don't see response to a question you've asked, you may find the response somewhere else in the comment section. It's just a time thing. It's becoming more and more difficult to do that. At this point, I am still reading every comment I can. Probably a few slip through the cracks, and if they do, I'm sorry about that. But I'm doing my best to keep on top of that. As the channel continues to grow, that may come to a point where I can't do that anymore. But at this point, I still am. So we're going to be doing our regular thing here where I'm going to go through the 6th level spells, one school at a time. I'm going to rank them from my favorite to my least favorite. I'm going to use my regular ranking system, which, if you don't remember, is red means I don't recommend the spell. Orange means I think the spell is overly circumstantial, useful in that circumstance, but not useful enough in enough situations to recommend preparing it. Purple is a modest recommendation. I think it's an okay spell, and if you like it, you should prepare it. Green spell is a strong recommendation for a spell. I think it's a good spell, well worth considering. And a blue spell, I think, is so good that you really have to think about why you wouldn't take that spell or why you wouldn't prepare that spell. So that is my rating system. Let's get started. So we're going to start with the Abjuration school, and my favorite Abjuration spell is Globe of Invulnerability. Now, Globe of Invulnerability, I should say, is a spell that the first time I read it, when I was really new to 5th edition, I thought it was an amazing spell. And since then, my views on it have steadily declined. I still think it's an okay spell. What it does is you cast it, creates a 10-foot radius globe around you, and no spell of 5th level or lower can get through that. If you upcast a spell of 5th level or lower, so it's above 5th level, it still can't get through it. Because it's 10-foot radius, you can potentially have your allies within the radius, protecting them from spells as well. So all those things really good if you're going to be taking on a spellcaster, because even the most powerful spellcasters don't have a lot of slots above 5th level. So we are significantly reducing their ability to affect the party. My issue is the concentration. Because we're concentrating on this spell, it really prevents us from doing much else. We can cast spells that don't require concentration, but because those spells are few and far between, it can become more difficult to use this spell effectively. You really have to kind of plan your spell slots. If you're going to be using Globe of Invulnerability, what else are you going to prepare that you're capable of casting while it's up? Now, I should note that when you're inside the globe, you can still cast spells out of the globe, and area of effect spells are excluded from the globe. So if they cast, say, a fireball just outside the globe, those within the globe are still protected. So overall, as a defensive spell, I still think this is a good spell, but because it uses concentration, prevents you from doing much else, and it's only protecting you against spells, I don't think it's an amazing spell. I think it's okay, and you need to be prepared for the fact that spellcasters can choose to do non-spell attacks, or if they can work their way within the globe, it's going to cease to protect you. So these are 2 things you need to consider. My least favorite Abjuration spell is Guards and Wards. Now, I constantly get told, as I review spells like this, in the comments, people will say, spells like this are intended for the DM because you might have an enemy spellcaster, they have some kind of wizard tower, and then they use Guards and Wards to create all these effects that players have to deal with, and it's pretty interesting in those regards. Sure. If you're a DM and you want to make a wizard and give them some interesting things, you might consider this. But these reviews are for players. If you are playing a wizard, and you're a standard adventuring wizard, being able to do a bunch of kind of minor defenses on a static location isn't really going to serve you. Now, if you cast the same spell over a year, the effects become permanent. So maybe if you are playing in a campaign where you have a home base, and that home base is something you want to protect, and you have a huge amount of downtime, you can set this up and make it permanent. You might want it in those circumstances. But for your standard D&D campaign, you're a wizard, you're out adventuring. It's not largely about you being in your stronghold and having things come to you. It's the other way around. And in those cases, Guards and Wards just isn't the spell you want. So I just can't recommend this spell for a wizard PC. So that brings us into our Conjuration spells. And the first Conjuration spell, my favorite, is Scatter. So what Scatter does is you're going to select 5 creatures. I assume you can select yourself as well. And all those creatures teleport up to 120 feet wherever you choose. So the obvious use here is if you have your party and combat has turned against you and you have a situation where you might lose, you could use this as a quick getaway for you and your companions. The other possibility is you can use it tactically. You can rearrange your companions and potentially enemies to give you the tactical advantage in the combat. The other possibility is you can just use it on your enemies. So you cast it on 5 enemies. Now they get a saving throw, but assuming some fail, you can get them 120 feet away, and that might have a situation where they can no longer participate in the combat. So you do the standard divide and conquer thing. So what I like about this spell is none of those things are super powerful, but you get a lot of versatility here. You get a lot of tactical uses. You have the use for getting away, and the use for resetting the combat, divide and conquer. And because it has all these different things, it's not using your concentration, so it's something you can do while you're concentrating on something else. I think that Scatter is a pretty good spell, one well worth preparing. Now, I actually don't like either of the other Conjuration spells. The first one I'll talk about is Arcane Gate. So we just talked about a Conjuration spell that has a teleport effect that I really like. Arcane Gate has a teleport effect, and I just think it's far, far worse. You're going to create 2 portals, and you have to concentrate on them. And then they remain up. They have to be within your line of sight. And you can have anyone move through one, and they appear at the other spot. And what it really comes down to is that's kind of neat, but it's using your concentration, and it is also just really circumstantial. The cases where this can be used in combat really depend on the right circumstances appearing in combat where those 2 portals is going to be super useful to you. You need to be able to have maybe allies pop in and out of a dangerous situation, or maybe you want to have some kind of choke point where enemies get pushed off somewhere where they don't want to be. But these kinds of things, you just can't count on them occurring in a combat. And they're rare enough that I just don't think this is worth preparing for you. And my least favorite Conjuration spell, and I know I'll probably butcher the name, is Drawmij's Instant Summon. So this spell is a ritual spell or a regular spell, and what it allows you to do is take an object that's 10 pounds or less, and you can teleport it to your current location. So there are probably circumstances where that'll be useful for you, but really, really rare circumstances. Rare enough that I really can't even give this an orange rating. This requires a 1,000 gold piece material component that is consumed during this spell. So this really is the kicker for me. It takes a spell that I think is circumstantially good and makes it so unlikely to be good that I can't recommend this spell at all. So that brings us to Divination. There's only one spell with Divination, and that's True Seeing. True Seeing is kind of an iconic spell. You cast it, you get True Sight for an hour, and True Sight basically means you can see through illusions, you can see invisible, you can see into the ethereal plane, you can basically see everything. It's also going to allow you to do things like see into magical darkness. So there's a lot of uses here. It doesn't use your concentration. So this might be something we can combine with something else, like a darkness spell, for example, to gain some advantages. But remember, we're talking about 6th level spells here. So those kind of combinations are really effective at lower levels. We're now kind of in the level point where getting advantage using darkness, those aren't as big a deal as they used to be. Now, it's kind of ironic, but Diviners actually probably get the least use out of this because they have that third eye ability, which is already going to give them access to abilities that we might use True Sight for. Now they do get a 5th level spell slot back if they cast this spell, so it's a lower resource cost than other casters, but I think they get less from it as well. Overall, I think as a 6th level spell, this is a significant resource cost to be able to do these kinds of things. We can cast See Invisible as a much lower level, but True Sight, of course, does many more things, but casting a 6th level slot just for improved power of observation is something you really need to think about. I think circumstantially this can be a great spell, but I don't think it's necessarily something that I would recommend having on your preparation slot unless you have reason to believe you're going to need it. That brings us to our enchantment school. Only 2 enchantment spells. My favorite by far is Mass Suggestion. Mass Suggestion is actually one of my favorite 6th level spells in the game. If you've watched my build videos, you'll notice whenever I get to 6th level spells, whether I'm playing a bard or I'm playing a sorcerer or I'm playing a wizard, Mass Suggestion is always something that's going to be one of my top considerations. This spell does not use your concentration, affects up to 12 creatures. We don't have to worry about friendly fire. They all make a saving throw, or they're treated as if under a suggestion spell. Now, suggestion is a pretty good spell at 2nd level, and it uses your concentration. So this does 12 times the effect, no concentration. So it's more than 12 times better than a regular suggestion spell. This lasts for 24 hours as well. 24 hours, 12 creatures, no concentration. Just an amazing spell. And there's no specific kind of wizard that I think gets any particular benefit here, but I think it's good for all wizards to take. The next enchantment spell, which I'm not a big fan of, is Otto's Irresistible Dance. And I've had more arguments with people over Otto's Irresistible Dance than any other 6th level spell in the game, for sure. And of all the spells that I've had the most arguments with people, this is among the top. So keep what I'm saying with a grain of salt, because a lot of people really love this spell. I don't love this spell. What it does is you're going to target one creature, and that creature is going to have disadvantage on attacks, advantage to be attacked, and disadvantage on a couple saving throws. That will last for 1 round, and then the creature can take a saving throw. This requires its action, and it's a wisdom saving throw, and it can do that every round. Now, I guess the big thing here is we're targeting one creature, and we're not completely defeating this creature. We're giving it disadvantage on attack rolls and advantage to be attacked. So if it's something like a spellcaster, or it has spell options, or it has any kind of non-attack options, the disadvantage on attacks can be worked around. The advantage to be attacked, again, it really depends on what kind of defenses it has. Can it get somewhere where maybe it can't be attacked so easily? There's ways creatures might be able to work around that as well. There's a lot of workarounds here. Never mind the fact that they can potentially get a saving throw every round to get out of it. Now, yes, the first round you cast this sticks automatically. They don't get a saving throw against the initial casting of the spell, and that does improve it. I think if they did get that, this spell would be utter garbage. Because they don't get that saving throw in the first round, you're guaranteed at least 1 round where you will have advantage to attack them, and you're guaranteed at least 1 round where they will have disadvantage on their attacks. Is that worth a 6th level slot? I don't think it is, but there are a lot of people who disagree with me. So keep that in mind, but personally, I don't think this spell just measures up to other 6th level spells. I will say, though, if you are an enchanter, with your split enchantment ability, you can do this spell with twice the effect. That really turns this around because it's twice as good. So if it's twice as good, then I think it's a pretty good spell. So if you are an enchanter, I would say this is probably purple or green, maybe green. If you are not an enchanter, I generally think that this spell is not worth preparing. So let's get into our evocation spells. My favorite evocation spell at this level is Contingency. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Contingency is one of those spells that we talk about high-level wizards getting that kind of separates them from other spellcasters. So what Contingency does is you're going to cast this in your off time, and then you're going to create a trigger that's going to have a spell effect of your choice, a 5th level or lower, take effect. So we could just use this to, throw a fireball whenever we say the word fireball. And then we could do 1 time on an adventure a free fireball as a free action. Generally, and I would agree with this, the consensus is this is far more effective as a defense spell. So what you would do is you're going to take a defensive spell and you're going to have a trigger where maybe this comes into effect if you take a certain number of hit points damage, or maybe it comes into effect if you say a command word, and then something's going to happen like a dimension door to get you out of trouble, or an Otiluke's resilient sphere to give you a sphere around you that will protect you from further damage. Keep in mind though, if it is a spell that requires concentration, it's going to still require concentration. So it might break the concentration of a spell you currently have up. Something to keep in mind when you're selecting. My personal choice that I tend to go for is to use Dimension Door. So I get in trouble, maybe I have a certain hit point limit, I reach that hit point limit, I get a Dimension Door, I can get out of trouble. If I am still maintaining concentration on a spell, I maintain that concentration on that spell. And so even if I'm a far distance from the combat, I can still potentially contribute to that combat. So that's usually the way I go. I usually go for something like if I reach half my hit points. Now, I've heard of other triggers as well. I've heard of people put this up if they take any damage. I think that's a little premature. Taking 1 point of damage is not something you want to be wasting your contingency on. I would be thinking closer to half hit points or lower than half hit points, or potentially a command word, though keep in mind that you can't necessarily do a command word when it's not your turn. The contingency lasts for 10 days, so this is a long duration. Then after 10 days, you're going to have to reset it. Usually you're going to have at least some downtime within a 10-day period, so that's normally not going to cause a problem. There will be some campaigns where there's like literally no downtime. Then this might be hard to reset, but most of the time that's not a problem. My next favorite evocation spell at this level is Otiluke's Freezing Sphere. So this is a kaboom spell. It does 10d6 damage, which isn't good damage for this level. But there are a couple reasons why this spell, I think, is a decent spell. The first is a pretty circumstantial thing, but if you hit water with this spell, it freezes the water. So it might create some minor terrain differences, so you might be able to travel somewhere where otherwise it would be underwater. More importantly, if creatures are within that water, they're frozen in that water, and there's no saving throw versus that. So you cast a spell and they're trapped. So when that circumstance comes up, this can be really effective, and it's not using your concentration. The final use is you can create a sphere and you can give it to another party member, and then they can throw it later. We can use this for kind of a Nova thing. So let's say we know a combat's going to occur, we cast this spell, we hand it off to somebody who maybe doesn't have any area of effect options. We can go into the combat, we can cast an area of effect spell, then this other party member on the same round can throw this sphere, and you get another 10d6 damage over an area. So this could really wipe out a bunch of weaker creatures, or potentially just soften a bunch of stronger creatures. So that, in addition to the ability to freeze water, I think makes this an okay spell, though I don't think blasting on its own for the 10d6 damage would by itself be worth it. The next spell for evocation, Chain Lightning. So Chain Lightning is a straight out blast. You can target up to 4 creatures and they're each going to take 10d8 damage. Now 10d8 damage at this level is kind of so-so damage. It's better than a lot of other blasts at this level. But when we consider what we could do with lower level spells, it's not a huge increase. We're talking about 45 points of damage, save for half. I mean, even if we upcast a fireball, we're doing close to that amount of damage. So the damage isn't that great. But the reason why this would be better than, say, an upcast fireball is because we're selecting 4 creatures. We don't have to worry about friendly fire. So we have a bunch of creatures in melee. Maybe we're concentrating on a different spell. We want some way to contribute that's not going to require concentration. We can select 4 enemies with this spell. They each take a moderate amount of damage. That's a 6th level spell, so that's a big investment for that. Something to think about. I'm not sure this is a spell I'm necessarily going to gravitate to. Also, if you are an evoker, you get Empowered Evocation, which gives you your intelligence bonus to 1 damage roll. The way I read this spell, that's only going to be 1 of those 4 creatures. So we're not even going to get our full amount from that as an evoker. But because we can cast it in combat, when area of effect maybe isn't so great, it gives us another option that maybe we didn't have if you want to concentrate on blasting. this is something that you might want to consider just because it can blast in a situation where a lot of other blast spells just don't work. My next favorite evocation spell, now we're getting into the spells for evocation that I don't think are that great, is Sunbeam. So Sunbeam, first you illuminate bright light 30 feet and dim light another 30 feet. That light is treated as sunlight. So if we are facing something like drow or something that have effects from being in sunlight, this could be circumstantially good in that situation. If I'm taking on a vampire, this could be really good in that situation. Then we get the ability to do this blast. We get a blast automatically on the first round, and then we can use our action on continuing rounds to do this blast. And it's a line, and it does really bad damage with a 6th level spell. So that's not the kind of damage you want to be doing with a 6th level spell using your action. So I don't see a lot of use for that. So really all this is giving us is sunlight and the ability to do a crappy blast on our action. So the only time I'm really going to want to use this is if I need sunlight in order to defeat a certain creature. So I'm taking on a vampire lord. This might be good because then if we can get that vampire lord within the area of sunlight, then creatures can take down that vampire lord and it can't, take its gaseous form or whatever. That's really circumstantial. When it comes to just regular adventuring, we don't know what we're going to be taking on. Sunbeam is not a spell I want to use. As a blast, it doesn't hold up to other blasts of even lower level. My least favorite spell at this level is Wall of Ice. And this is one of those cases where I talked about this with Confusion at a lower level, where in a vacuum, if I didn't have access to other wall spells, this is a wall spell and I would be pretty happy with it. But we have some great wall spells at 5th level. We have Wall of Force, we have Wall of Stone. These are both great wall spells, and Wall of Ice isn't as good as either of them. I guess the advantage here is it can do some damage, but it doesn't do a lot of damage. So damage isn't the main reason we would be casting this spell. We're casting this spell for a wall, so we can create area around ourselves or around enemies, or divide and conquer with a straight wall. And this just doesn't do as good a job as lower level spells. So I don't see the reason why I would take Wall of Ice over Wall of Stone, for example. And because this is using a 6th level slot instead of a 5th level slot, I'm really not impressed with it. So let's get into our illusion spells. My favorite illusion spell at this level is Mental Prison. So Mental Prison, what you do is you're going to target one creature, makes an intelligence saving throw. So that's a good thing. If it fails that saving throw, it perceives this barrier around it. And the idea is that it's trapped in the barrier, it is restrained, it's blinded to any areas beyond there. So you can kind of think of this as a bit of a wall of force. We're taking a creature and we're completely encasing it. Now it gets a saving throw, which Wall of Force doesn't do, and it's a 6th level spell, which Wall of Force isn't. But the advantage here is a Wall of Force will actually protect that creature. If you put a creature in a mental prison, you can still attack it, and it's restrained, so you're going to get advantage on those attacks. So if we're not using Divide and Conquer, instead we just want to debuff a creature, make it so it is difficult for it to attack us, and then we can attack it. Mental Prison's really good for that. Now, there is one caveat here. It really depends on one thing about this spell. The idea of this spell is it creates this barrier, you kind of choose what it is, and the creature perceives this barrier. And presumably, the creature will stay in that area because it doesn't want to go through the wall of lava. But if your DM chooses to have the creature test the barrier, then it takes some damage, and then the spell effect ends. So if your DM is likely to do that, this isn't such a good spell anymore. Now it becomes kind of a moderate blast. So if your DM is going to play this, that the enemy is going to be scared of what it sees and stay where it is, this can be super effective. If the DM is going to play this where the creature is likely to test it, not so great. So you know your DM. If your DM is one of the former, I'd call this green. If your DM is one of the latter, I'd call this orange. The next spell for illusion is Programmed Illusion. So what Programmed Illusion does is it's a permanent illusion. You can create a trigger within the spell area, and if that trigger is set off, an illusion appears of your choice. And this can happen anytime after the initial casting of the spell. Now, I've talked before about what constitutes the range of the initial spell. So if the limit of the initial spell is the range from where you are based on the location where you are, this spell is going to be really circumstantial. You can use it as kind of a replacement for a magic mouth. You can use it maybe as a defensive thing, but really circumstantial stuff. If your DM considers a location to be something that is potentially movable, then this could be a lot more useful to you because you could bring it with you adventuring. If you cast it on your ring, then maybe when you're in combat and you speak a command word, a duplicate of you will appear. This would be free. This would not require your concentration. This might draw enemy attacks. Then that could be super useful to you. You could potentially stack this. You could have several programmed illusions. And if you are an illusionist, you can use malleable illusions to even change the nature of those illusions. So again, this is going to depend largely on your DM. So with the illusion spells at this level, a lot comes down to DM interpretation. That's not unusual for illusionists. If you are going to play an illusionist, know that your DM plays well with illusions. If they don't play well with illusions, not only do you not want to play an illusionist, you probably want to avoid illusion spells to a large degree. That's true of both spells at this level. But if your DM likes illusions and likes being creative with illusions, then this spell can be very useful. So let's get into Necromancy. Great news, there are some good spells with Necromancy at 6th level. Finally. The first spell, and my favorite Necromancy spell at this level, is Magic Jar. Now, Magic Jar, once in a while I review a spell that, I can't really go into super detail in these videos because I'm going over so many spells. Magic Jar is one of those spells that probably deserves its own video. I'm not promising that right now, but it is something that I might consider in the future because Magic Jar is one of those spells that requires a lot of thought. It is one of those spells I get a lot of comments about people who don't really know how to use it or don't really understand how it works. I'm going to go over the basics of that right now. So the idea is you cast a spell, you need a container. So it can be a small container, it can be a gem, it can be a crystal. I personally like a diamond. A diamond is something that is going to be hard to destroy. It needs to be valued at least 500 gold pieces. At this point, that's not a huge deal. It's not a one-time use. You can cast a spell again and again and use the same container. So here's how it works. You cast a spell and then you enter the container and then your body remains outside the container. Once you're in the container, you can perceive around the container within 100 feet as if your character was there. So presumably you can see, you can hear, you can smell, you could even feel things like if you're in a warm room or a cold room, those kinds of things. Within that 100 feet, you can possess any humanoid. Now, humanoid's important. You can't possess anything. You can only possess humanoids. But you can possess the humanoid. It makes a saving throw. If it fails that saving throw, you've possessed it, no concentration, and it is technically permanent, or as long as you want it to be. Once you possess that creature, you gain its statistics, but you keep your class features and your mental scores. So you can still cast spells and all that kind of stuff. And depending on the creature, you'll have a different amount of hit points and maybe some other abilities. You don't get any class abilities of that creature, but you get all its other abilities. At any time, while you're possessing that creature, you can use your action and you can simply go back to your container and that creature regains control of its body. It does require that the container that you cast a spell on is within 100 feet. So, for example, let's say your hit points are getting low and you're worried about reaching 0 hit points. You might want to use your action at that point to switch back. And then the creature regains its control of its body and it's almost dead. And one of the great things about this spell is, even after that point, you're once again in your initial container, and then you can possess a different creature. You can even possess the same creature after a 24-hour duration period has passed. So this spell can just go on and on and on. Now, two things to keep in mind. Number one, if you're possessing a creature and that creature dies while you're possessing it, you need to make a charisma saving throw against your own spell DC, or you die. So you definitely don't want that to happen. The second thing to keep in mind is if you are in your container and the container is destroyed, you are sent to your own body if it's within 100 feet. If it's not within 100 feet, you die. So there's two scenarios where this could lead to your character's death. So you need to think about that carefully. you need to have a container within 100 feet of the creature that you've possessed, and you need to have your body within 100 feet of the container. How you can do that? There's lots of ways. You could have a Tensor's floating disc with maybe some kind of container with your body inside it. Maybe a minion is carrying your body around. Maybe once you possess a creature, you just take the diamond and stick it in your pocket. There are ways to do it. You're going to have to think about that though beforehand, because if you're careless with this spell, you could lose your character. So how good is possessing another humanoid? Because remember, we are limited to humanoids. Well, it depends. So there is some circumstantiality here. As an infiltration tool, I love this. We can possess an enemy and then we can go and we appear like them, we sound like them. So we could use it as a great way to infiltrate. We could then jump to somebody else and infiltrate somewhere else. And because there's no duration, because we can do this over and over again, this could be immensely powerful. Also, straight adventuring. If we know we're going to be adventuring somewhere where we're likely to come across a lot of humanoids, this can also be a good just straight adventuring spell. Some humanoids are really powerful. For example, let's say you're going to go somewhere where you know there's going to be a lot of Gith. Well, for example, if you were to possess a Githzerai Anarch, it would have a +2 on its saving throw to resist this spell, so it's probably going to fail its save. Once you possess it, you've got 144 hit points. You've got legendary actions that include a teleport. It includes a reverse gravity. You have a bunch of innate spells. Presumably, you can still cast innate spells because they're not class abilities. Those include a Wall of Force, a Plane Shift, a Globe of Invulnerability. So if you can possess the right creature, in terms of just straight out adventuring, this could be insanely powerful. Now, other humanoids, it really depends. Possessing a commoner is going to give you a very low number of hit points. Reasonable chance of death. If you die, you have to make a save or you die. So it depends a little bit on where you're going to be and what kind of humanoids you expect to come across. If you're not going to come across any humanoids, this isn't going to be any use to you at all. But if you are going to come across a lot of humanoids, this might even want to be something that you cast beforehand and then have a party member just bringing the container around so that you're ready to possess creatures as they come up. So it depends. And again, I think this is one of those spells that you need to think about carefully beforehand. There needs to be some planning. But if that planning takes place, if the situation is right, this spell becomes pretty much unmatched in the game in how powerful it can be. My next favorite Necromancy spell at this level is Soul Cage. So Soul Cage is a reaction cast. So what happens is when a humanoid dies within range, you can use your reaction and you trap its soul. And once you trap that soul, then you can basically do 6 cool things with it. And there's variable things you can do. The first is you can do a little bit of healing to yourself. So you can heal 2d8 hit points. So potentially you can do that 6 times. That could be 12d8 hit points healing. That's a reasonable amount of hit points for the level. Second thing you can do is Query Soul. So Query Soul is basically asking the soul a question. If it knows the answer, it must answer you truthfully. So as a divination or a way of just extracting information from an enemy, a good use there. The third use is Borrow Experience. You use a bonus action. You get advantage on an attack roll or an ability check or a saving throw that you happen to come across in the next round. Now, because it uses your bonus action, this isn't something we can use as a reaction for a saving throw we didn't know was going to happen. But if we know we're going to make a save in the next round, it's a good use of that. Otherwise, it's an okay use. I mean, advantage on an attack roll or an ability check. Ability checks probably more often come out of combat. You need to make a history roll, you use your bonus action, you get advantage on the history roll, those kinds of things. Not a huge advantage here, but I think it could be useful. The final one is Eyes of the Dead. So what happens here is, this is a great divination thing with a necromancy spell, is that anywhere that humanoid has ever been, you can divine that location. And then it's basically like casting a clairvoyance, except it can go anywhere where that creature has ever been before. So there's great divination stuff here, great ways to question or find out information about somebody who you've just killed, or a way to get just a little bit of healing or some basic buffs to yourself. Doesn't use your concentration. Overall, I think the spell does a lot of different things, and they're kind of cool things. So overall, I think this is a good spell to prepare. My next favorite necromancy spell at this level is Eyebite, and I really like Eyebite. It's kind of shocking to me that it's actually my third favorite Necromancy spell at 6th level, because it's a really good spell. You cast Eyebite on yourself, and for the next minute, you can do, as an action on your turn, a bunch of things that can essentially take out an opponent. You get 3 different options. So on your turn, you pick an enemy and they make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail their saving throw, you get one of 3 options. Number 1, you can put them asleep. So if they're asleep for the duration of the spell unless they're woken up by an ally. And if they're woken up by an ally, that requires an action to do. So this is something I'd want to do in a case where I don't think they're likely to be woken up by an ally. Maybe they're the last enemy of the fight, for example. Or maybe they're separated from any friendly enemies. Or maybe they're the kind of enemies that aren't likely to wake each other up. Maybe they're a bunch of chaos demons or mindless animals, or those kinds of things that might not be likely to wake each other up. In any of those cases, asleep is my favorite because you're taking them completely out of the fight. They don't get another saving throw. And then you can just finish them off at your leisure. The second one is Panicked, and Panicked is also really good. So Panicked is the one I'd use in a situation where I look at sleep and I think that somebody might wake them, then I'm going to do Panicked. So Panic gives them the frightened condition and they have to run away. So it's a little bit like hitting them with a fear spell. And like the fear spell, they don't get a saving throw every round. So the 60-foot range is the limitation here. There is a good chance they're going to get to 60-foot range from you within a round or 2. And then the spell ends. And so that could happen. But it depends. I mean, sometimes creatures aren't very fast. They might have terrain that's causing them problems. And just having somebody turn out of combat and run away for a couple rounds could have a huge impact on a combat. So compared to sleep, I don't think it's as good. But if the person who's sleeping is likely to just be woken up, then this is probably the better choice. The final one is Sickened. Sickened is my least favorite of the 3. So you cause the Sickened effect on somebody, they have disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks, and then they get a saving throw at the end of each of their rounds. So because they get a saving throw every round, this becomes my least favorite of those options. I'm generally going to either put things asleep or get them panicked. So this lasts for 1 minute and it uses your concentration. So basically, we're going to get 10 chances to do one of these effects to creatures. So this becomes the kind of spell that I like to do because we're casting one spell and it kind of sets us up for an entire battle. So as a resource cost, casting one spell isn't so bad. And then we have something reasonably effective we can do with our action every round of a combat. So overall, I think this is a good spell and well worth preparing. We're now into the Necromancy spells I'm not so fond of. The first one's Create Undead. So Create Undead creates 3 ghouls or maintains control over 3 ghouls that you've cast this on before. Lasts for 24 hours, and then those 3 ghouls will respond to your commands, and you use your bonus action to issue those commands. Now you can issue general commands like guard this door, and they'll keep doing that, or attack those enemies, and presumably they're going to keep doing that, so it's not necessarily going to use your bonus action every round. But the thing is 3 ghouls at this level, not a big deal. Ghouls don't have a lot of hit points, they don't do a lot of damage. Even if you're a necromancer, you get undead thralls, that's going to give them maybe another 10 to 12 hit points. They might do another 4 to 5 points of damage with their attacks. Even that doesn't really boost these creatures. Now we're looking at creatures that have low 30 hit points and 2d4 plus 6 damage. It's not a big deal at this level. Easy for enemies to take out. It's using your 6th level slot, using some bonus actions, not doing a lot of damage. So there's not a lot going on here. Yes, we have more creatures in action economy, but we have a lot lower level spells that give us these kinds of options without using 6th level spell slots to do it. Upcast, this spell is really bad. We can use 8th level, 9th level spell slots on this. We can get things like wights and mummies, which are better creatures, but considering those spell levels, casting a 9th level spell to get 3 mummies is a terrible use of a 9th level spell. So I don't think this spell scales well either. My least favorite spell for Necromancy, and potentially my least favorite 6th level spell in the game, is Circle of Death. So Circle of Death is a spell that the wizard casts, and it does a huge area, 60-foot radius. That's a massive area of 8d6 necrotic damage, Constitution save for half. So 8d6 damage is the damage we would get from a 3rd level fireball. And then Constitution save means it's probably going to do less damage than your average fireball. And there's friendly fire. in a 60-foot radius. So unless you're adventuring by yourself and surrounded by tons of enemies, there is very little reason why I could ever consider taking this spell. It is going to hurt our allies. It is not going to do the kind of damage we would expect from this level spell. The huge area, I do not think saves this spell. I think it's a bad spell, and it's one of those examples where the designers seem to show this bias against necromancy spells. That brings us to our final school, which is transmutation, and I have to admit, there is not a single transmutation spell at this level I think is really good, and there are a lot of them. So let's just get into it. But I guess my favorite transmutation spell at this level is Disintegrate. Now, my biggest problem with Disintegrate is I know players that have taken this spell thinking it was going to be an effective blast. And it's really just not an effective blast. You target a single creature, and if it makes its saving throw, nothing happens. We're facing more and more creatures at this point that have legendary resistance, or just really good saving throws, and often magical resistance. So we really can't count on creatures failing their saving throws for this. If they fail their saving throw, though, they'll take, on average, about 75 points of damage. That's good damage for the level, but considering the chance of this not working, I think it's a terrible risk. So for people who are considering taking this because they think it's going to be an effective blast, I strongly recommend against it. But what this spell does have going for it is it can destroy force effects. So if you get caught in a wall of force, you can very clearly destroy it with the Disintegrate spell. In fact, it says specifically under the Disintegrate spell works on a wall of force, and it says specifically under wall of force that Disintegrate works on it. What's a little less clear, but I still think works, is it could also be used on something like a force cage. So if you are trapped in a force cage, you could use a Disintegrate spell to get out of it, or if an ally's in a force cage, you could cast a Disintegrate spell to get rid of the force cage. And Sage Advice has confirmed, Jeremy Crawford has confirmed, Disintegrate does work on a force cage. So you might have a DM who looks at Wall of Force and looks at force cage, notices the gap there that it doesn't mention Disintegrate working on it. If that comes up and they're looking for some kind of evidence that this works on a force cage, you can point them to that Sage Advice. But that use for it is obviously really circumstantial. I don't think I can remember very many situations where I have a wizard trapped in a force cage. It maybe has happened at some point, but I just can't remember a case where that's happened. But if it does happen, this is the best way out of there, because force cage, remember, unlike Wall of Force we can just teleport out of it. But force cage actually restricts teleports. So Disintegrate is actually the most effective way to get out of it. So in that circumstance, it's your best option. Or if you have an ally in a force cage, it's your best option. Super circumstantial, perfect for that situation. As a regular blast, I don't think it's very good. So my next favorite transmutation spell at this level, I guess, is Create Homunculus. So this is a 1,000 gold piece cost spell, and it creates what is kind of just an improved familiar. A Homunculus, it can fly, it doesn't have a lot of hit points, 5 hit points, so it's pretty easy to kill. But it functions a lot like a familiar. The big difference between this and a familiar is this has what is called the shared mind trait. And this means that, number one, we can communicate with this creature over any distance. We can perceive what it perceives over any distance. It can also share all our languages, so it can communicate for us. So there are utility uses here that extend beyond what we can do with Find Familiar. We can use this as a long-range messenger. We can use this as a scout over a much higher area than we could otherwise do with Find Familiar. But this is a 6th level spell and a 1,000 gold piece cost. Is that worth it for a spell that is a slight improvement over a 1st level spell? I'm not sure it is. I think it's okay. I mean, I do think they are better than a familiar overall. And I do like Find Familiar. So taking this instead of Find Familiar, I don't think is a bad thing. It's something you would want to do in your off time. If we have a campaign where we can access lots of spells and put lots of spells in our spellbook, I could totally see getting this spell, putting it in our spellbook, casting it in our off time, and having the Homunculus. But if we're in a campaign where we're kind of only getting those 2 spells per level, then I never would take this spell. I just don't think it does nearly enough to warrant one of those precious 2 slots. Finally, I should at least talk about the fact that we can sacrifice our own hit points and give them to the Homunculus, and I'm never going to do that. I think that's a bad use of this spell. So I'll acknowledge it's in the spell description. I recommend don't even go near that. So my next favorite spell at this level is Investiture of Flame. So there's a lot of these investiture spells at this level, and Flame is probably my favorite of them, but I don't think any of them are great. The reason I think that this one is the best of those is it gives you immunity to fire. Fire is reasonably common. Getting immunity is something that we otherwise haven't been able to do up to this point. We've been able to get resistance, but not immunity. This uses our concentration. It technically gives us resistance to cold damage as well. Now, if we're facing cold damage, this isn't the best way to deal with that, but it's there. Lasts for 10 minutes. Technically, it allows us to shed light as well. That's pretty minor. And then finally, it allows us to use our action to do really terrible damage, 48 damage on our round with this. I'd never do that. 48 damage using your action just isn't a good use of your action. So the only reason I'm really going to use this is for immunity to fire. That's really circumstantial, and therefore this is a super circumstantial spell. That brings us to our next spell, Investiture of Ice. So this one I think is worse than Investiture of Fire. It gives you immunity to cold damage. So circumstantially, if I know I'm going to be facing cold damage, this might be okay. It gives us resistance to fire damage. Not a good way to get that. It does some difficult terrain around us, which I think is super circumstantial and very minor. And it allows us to do a cone on our action that it's a 15-foot cone that does 46 damage, con save for half. So that's a terrible use. Just an awful use of your action every round. It's actually worse than the Investiture of Fire ability. So I would never, ever, ever do that. The only reason I'm ever going to use this spell is for immunity. Immunity to cold damage in this case. 6th level spell to get immunity to cold damage I think is really circumstantial and not all that powerful. But if I'm going up against an ancient white dragon, I might want to have this up as the battle begins to be immune to that super powerful breath weapon. So that brings us to our next transmutation spell, which is Investiture of Stone. So I think this one is worse than Investiture of Fire or Investiture of Ice, because this one doesn't give us any immunities. It gives us resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage that is non-magical. That's really minor for this level. We can use our action to knock creatures prone. That's even worse use of our action than doing the 46 damage. But the one thing this does is it allows us to glide through earth, and it as if it were air. So that is, again, an ability that might be useful circumstantially. We need to move through a large area of stone. We can cast a spell. We can do that for up to 10 minutes. So, again, in the exact right circumstance, not a bad spell, but definitely not something I would normally prepare. Now we're getting into the really bad ones. So, Investiture of Wind is the worst of the investiture spells. What it does is it gives you flight, very similar to the 3rd level spell, Flight, 60-foot movement rate. And then we get some super, super minor stuff that's hardly worth mentioning. Ranged weapon attacks get disadvantage. That's nothing at this level. Our action ability is the worst of all of them. We can create a cube that does 2d10 damage. This is a 6th level spell. 2d10 damage. That's just ridiculous. Why would they even put that in this spell? Just don't even include it at all. It's just a trap. Don't do it. The only thing this really gives you is flight, which we could already do with a lower level slot. So I would never take this. I think you're better off just keeping fly as a 3rd level spell and don't worry about the spell at all. My next favorite spell for transmutation at this level, I guess, is Flesh to Stone. So this is, technically speaking, really our first save or die spell, except it's not really a save or die spell. It's a save, and if you fail that save, make another save, and if you fail that save, make another save, and if you fail that save, you die spell. Because what happens is you hit somebody with a Flesh to Stone, and the very first thing that happens is they get a saving throw. That saving throw is Constitution. That's not good. If they make that save, nothing happens. That's not good. If they fail their save, they're restrained, and they are restrained, and then the following round, they make another save. If they fail that save, they're still restrained. And then we go another round. And if they fail that save, then they're petrified. But they have to fail 3 saves. The spell ends if they succeed on 3 saves. So we really shouldn't expect the petrified condition to occur within the span of a combat. Because even if a creature fails its initial save, assuming it's making the occasional save, we're probably looking at 5 rounds before we see them petrified. At that point, this combat's probably over, and you have to be concentrating on that spell that entire time. So if that concentration is broken, then that will end the effect as well. So what this ends up kind of being is a restrained condition if they fail a Constitution saving throw. And that's a terrible use of a 6th level spell. The next one I want to talk about is Tensor's Transformation. This one is emotionally charged for a lot of people, including me, because I think it's a trap. I think it is a horrible trap for wizards. What it does is it gives you some pretty minor combat stuff. You get an extra attack if you don't already have one. And remember, if you're a wizard, you could get an extra attack already by becoming a Blade Singer. We get advantage on a couple saving throws, including Constitution saving throws. Now, assuming we have Warcaster, if we're making concentration saving throws, then we already have advantage on those saves. We get 50 temporary hit points. That's not a huge amount. And keep in mind, temporary hit points, when you lose them, still require concentration saves. So if we're hit, we're making saves or we're losing this spell. They're with advantage, but advantage is not certainty. It gives you proficiency in all martial weapons and all armor and shields. But keep in mind that if we're talking about heavy armors, you're not putting on heavy armor within the duration of this spell. Because if you weren't already proficient in that armor, you can't cast in it in the first place. So if we cast this spell, we don't have the armor on. And if we don't have the armor on, we don't have time to put it on. So that's pointless, right? Absolutely pointless. I guess we could put on something like leather armor if we're not happy with something like mage armor. And then we can use martial weapons that we otherwise couldn't use. But again, if we're using something like a strength-based weapon, we're still basing it off our strength, and we haven't increased our strength. We're getting advantage on attack rolls, but advantage on a strength attack roll with your average wizard is not going to be very good. We do a little bit more damage when we hit with a weapon, but again, we're attacking twice a round. At this point, fighters are already attacking 3 times a round or more. And then they have action surge. They might be attacking 5 or 6 times a round. You're attacking twice a round, and you're doing a little bit of extra damage. So the trap here is, this is kind of sold as a way that you can take your wizard, who is maybe a conjurer or something, and then you could cast it, and then you can frontline with the fighters and be reasonably effective. You can't. It just doesn't stack up to just being a fighter by a long shot. And by putting yourself in melee, you have the chance of being hit more often. When you're hit more often, you can expect to be making lots of concentration saves. Yes, they're made with advantage, but that is no guarantee. So this spell could be easily lost, and then you're in trouble. Now you're a wizard stuck in melee who's just taken a lot of damage. So I think it's a trap. Now, the reason this isn't my least favorite transmutation spell is I do think there are certain circumstances where this spell can be used to moderate effect. One thing that's been mentioned is if you're a Blade Singer. Blade Singers already get big bonuses on their concentration saves. You add advantage on that, this becomes pretty hard to break. Now, do I want to be going into combat and poking things with my rapier as a Blade Singer? Yes. Do I still want to be doing that with my Blade Singer at 11th level? Probably not. I don't think so. Because by the higher levels, Blade Singers aren't poking stuff with their rapier anymore. They're so much better at casting spells. When we cast Tensor's Transformation, we cannot cast spells while we concentrate on this. So it takes away the most powerful thing about a Blade Singer, your ability to cast spells. It makes you a little bit better in melee combat, but it's not going to bring you up to the level of the fighters. But in a situation where maybe you're coming up against something that has magic immunity, or a bunch of legendary resistances, and it's maybe resistant to magic anyway, and maybe we have used our spells that bypass saving throws, and we're not sure what to do, and we just want to be effective somehow. Maybe Tensor's Transformation as a Blade Singer isn't terrible. I don't think it's great. I don't think it's even good. I just think that in that circumstance, it's not awful. I mean, even with a War Mage, we can get bonuses on saving throws. Added together with the advantage, again, might be hard to break. But again, I just don't think this is bringing us enough good stuff. We're not doing the damage we need to do with this spell to make it worth taking our spellcasting ability away. But there are lots of people who disagree with me. There are people who think Tensor's Transformation is quite good on a Bladesinger. I wonder how they're playing their Bladesinger at 11th level, if they're in melee, poking with their rapier a lot and not casting a lot of spells, or only casting spells that improve their ability to poke with a rapier. For those people, Tensor's Transformation is the next level of that progression. I don't think that's nearly the most effective way to play a Bladesinger, but if that's the way you want to play your Bladesinger, Tensor's Transformation makes sense in that regard. Generally, I don't recommend it for pretty much any wizard. But my least favorite transmutation spell at this level is Move Earth. Move Earth just doesn't do very much. You can target sand, clay, or loose dirt, and you can reshape it. And it's a 6th level spell to do that. And those materials are not the materials you're likely to see when you're navigating a dungeon, or a castle, or any other number of places that you're more likely to be in at these higher levels. So this uses a 6th level spell for a pretty minor effect on a pretty circumstantial area. So add those things together, I think this is a bad spell and a waste of your 6th level slot. So that's it. Those are all the 6th level spells for Wizard. Next week, we'll be getting into our 7th level spells. Until then, I'm going to sit back and I'm going to relax and I'm going to have some fun because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, Optimancers, and I'll see you next time.